We should burn trash so then we don't have to put it in a landfill. We should burn wood because we've always done that. That's natural. In both cases, you're getting out, and I mean, I hate to benchmark things against coal, but you're getting much worse performance than you do from a coal-fired power plant. Wood and wet trash are just not as calorie dense as coal is. The particulate matter, the carbon monoxide, the things like that that are coming from burning wood are just really remarkable amounts of pollution. And because it is not as dense as coal, you have to burn way more of it to get the same amount of electricity, which means that you are ending up with more air pollution than you would continuing to burn coal. And we don't want them to continue to burn coal, right? Like
Of
that
course.
plant is going to stop burning, the one I'm thinking of is going to stop burning coal in 2035. And we are going to need electricity. But that does not mean that the rational or better thing to do is to keep the same plant running, but put a less efficient fuel in it.
Welcome, Wild Ones. I'm Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. This episode, our guest is Hudson Kingston. Hudson Kingston joined CURE in 2023 with a background in environmental law, public health law, and consumer protection. He has worked in both the Midwest and Washington, D.C. on litigation and policy related to climate change, water pollution impacts of mining, pesticide regulation, the environmental and health impacts of e-cigarettes, public records and government transparency, and environmental injustices perpetrated by the administrative state. At CURE, he works on rural energy policy, agency accountability under environmental and transparency laws, and working in coalitions to protect forests from industrialization and overexploitation. Hudson, welcome to the Green Root Podcast.
Wonderful being here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we set this up and wanted to record it and put it out in short notice because there is some stuff going down in Minnesota. So maybe tell us a little bit about what is happening.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, so I know that your audience is very focused on land use and forests, and even though this relates directly to that, this is a story about energy and electricity. So the Public Utilities Commission of Minnesota, which regulates all of the electrical utilities in our state, is going to make a decision in just about a month about what carbon-free means under our carbon-free energy law. And so this is a law that first passed in 2023. It has a very clear definition of exactly what carbon-free means. And we have, for the past 2 years, been fighting over whether they should apply that law correctly or whether they should do something else. And on January 15th, we'll know if they decide to do something else.
Yeah, that's kind of a big deal. So, what would they be sneaking in under these sorts of guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of different technologies at issue here. But so like I said, the 2023 law defines carbon-free energy as saying carbon-free means a technology that generates electricity without emitting carbon dioxide. That's it. Very straightforward, not any room for interpretation. Does it emit carbon dioxide or does it not? You wouldn't think that burning trees and garbage would be open to debate. But unfortunately, it has been open to debate. And this is sort of a long and boring story. But back in 2007, Minnesota got its first renewable portfolio standard. And in that standard, they defined biomass as including burning trash and implicitly burning wood. And so since 2007, we've had renewable energy that burns municipal waste and wood. And then in 2023, they added this definition for carbon-free energy. And since that was added, there's been very strong lobbying by the utilities, the waste industry, and the timber industry to keep the renewable standard uh, definition and basically just read out the carbon-free energy standard. They would like it if burning things that contain more carbon than coal, namely trash and wood, um, would be defined as totally carbon free without any analysis whatsoever.
Yeah, it's total madness. It's anti-scientific. It's against common sense. And unfortunately, this is nothing new. And some of our listeners may be aware that I was a part of something called the National Anti-Biomass Incineration Campaign in about 2010 as part of something Energy Justice Network was doing and several other organizations as well. And we were calling attention to the concerns with, quote, biomass incineration, as we like to call it, instead of their euphemisms. And that involved, of course, burning trees and trash and you name it, they throw it into these incinerators. And what was a bit perturbing was, of course, most of the public wasn't quite aware of this. They hear the term renewable. That sounds good enough for me. It's an obvious, important push. Fossil fuels, nuclear power, other things have plenty of issues around them. So, of course, we should be looking for alternatives while ideally also reducing our energy consumption and however that would be done. But unfortunately, we actually had a lot of environmental entities were not just absent to the fight, they were promoting this stuff. But I do this not to bring up past history so much as it seems as if after a while, the grassroots was able to push some of these larger organizations, and some of the larger organizations were kind of on board from the beginning a little bit with concerns. But it seems to now, over the last several years, become just common sense. Okay, this biomass stuff, let's sort of keep that off the list of the things that we're promoting. Maybe they'll allow some of these smaller heating facilities, which are still polluting, and people can draw their lines, I guess, wherever they want to. But it's not been a concerted push in the, let's say, conservation or environmental community that biomass energy is this sweet, awesome thing. So that's a positive, is what I have to say about that, right? So there is more information out there on this. There is more pushback on this. So would you say that that at least is gives us some solid ground for the pushback?
Yeah, I mean, I think in 2007, in any case, it was a political compromise, right? So like they have all these things that they want to burn. They want to burn landfill gas. They want to burn municipal waste. They want to burn some kinds of sewage sludge. They defined that as renewable because they were protecting these incumbents, you know, facilities that had already installed stuff to burn that stuff. But all of these are relatively small, and I think that's what you're talking about, you know, like they're not big energy producers. They are getting rid of trash and producing a lot of heat and a small amount of electricity. And basically they just wanted to sort of have their cake and eat it too and keep running their old plants. Now we're at a point where the discussion has shifted from can we keep these old plants running for another 5 years to do we want to set a standard that incentivizes new biomass plants of a much larger size that will have landscape level effects, not just using leftover garbage from other processes as the existing plants do, but rather requiring a constant input of new fuels from our landscape. And so that's sort of the interesting definition here, because like you're saying, I mean, we do have existing plants that, you know, under Minnesota rules anywhere are considered biomass, but they are not principally for making electricity for the grid. And when you talk about making electricity for the grid, that can be just massive power plants. You know, most of our power came from coal historically, and we're starting to get away from that. But the discussion right now and the specific proposal from Minnesota Power is to convert one of the biggest coal plants in the state to burn biomass. And that's just different from what the discussion was before.
Yeah, I guess there can be debate over whether it should be across the board. We should be skeptical of burning things. My position, I understand other people have more nuance, is that is burning really the answer to climate change? It seems pretty silly on its face, but I understand the prioritizing of these biggest facilities, the conversion of the coal facilities over to trees, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we're dealing with this on a variety of level, but I think Yeah, I mean, all I'll say is I think the messaging is important because if people are thinking, oh, well, it's okay sometimes to burn this stuff, and then other times somehow it's bad, whatever. That's getting into the weeds a bit. But let's talk a little bit about impacts for people who aren't aware. And it's funny, because I was so immersed in this issue, this was I tend to pick obsessive focuses. So right now, my obsessive focus tends to be this wildfire pretense logging on public lands, which ties directly into biomass energy and always has. But my focus before was biomass energy. So of course we were dealing with forests and the idea that if you build these facilities, they need to feed it. So they're just going to magically find new reasons to cut forests. So there's clear, obvious land impacts when it comes to forest ecosystems, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not all. We're talking about climate impacts, which we can maybe get into in a second, maybe some of the quote biogenic carbon framing, whatever, but it's air pollution. So there are noxious pollutants emitted from this. And do you want to talk a little bit about that? I can certainly spout on about that too.
Yeah, but we also should come back to that wildfire point you just
Oh,
made.
for
But yes,
sure.
um, so the funny thing about burning trash and wood is that, oh, it just makes intuitive sense. We should burn trash so then we don't have to put it in a landfill. We should burn wood because we've always done that. That's natural. In both cases, you're getting out, and I mean, I hate to benchmark things against coal, but you're getting much worse performance than you do from a coal-fired power plant. Wood and wet trash are just not as calorie dense as coal is, because science. I'm a lawyer. I don't know, but the particulate matter, the carbon monoxide, the things like that are coming from burning wood are just really remarkable amounts of pollution. And because it is not as dense as coal, you have to burn way more of it to get the same amount of electricity, which means that you are ending up with more air pollution than you would continuing to burn coal. And we don't want them to continue to burn coal, right? Like
Of
that
course.
plant is going to stop burning, the one I'm thinking of is going to stop burning coal in 2035, and we are going to need electricity. But that does not mean that the rational or better thing to do is to keep the same plant running but put a less efficient fuel in it. We have much better solutions to that in our energy system now, and most of them do not require fuel inputs of any kind at this point. Um, so yeah, it is remarkable. The other thing I'll say is that the company I'm thinking of, Minnesota Power, owns one 100-year-old coal plant that was converted to run on biomass, right? And it has recently violated its air permits a couple of times. The violations came because they burned too much coal for their air permit. So, I mean, when they say they're converting something to be a renewable energy center, that's also just a lie. They are still burning fossil fuels at those facilities. They burn woody biomass, and by that they often mean railroad ties, which is wood treated with fossil fuels to make them more toxic. Um, and they burn coal as needed in order to increase the amount of electricity output. So they'll just willingly violate their air permits. Um, and in the meantime, they have these big piles of railroad ties, of other wood wastes that may be contaminated with things like PFAS because they come from the paper industry. And then that gets incinerated and it rains down on the landscape for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. That's not great. It's not a good
No, it's
solution for
it's
our
not
energy
great.
system.
It's a step in the wrong direction. Yeah, I find it funny when people seem to not be able to hold two thoughts in their head at the same time. So they're like, I was accused in the past of being an advocate for coal by saying trees are also bad and may even be worse. And they're like, you love coal. How much are you getting from the coal industry? And it's like, do you even really think that? I'm not even sure if they were saying that in good faith. I think they just were upset about hearing information that made their push for this magic plug-in energy source uh, no longer viable. But I'm glad you brought up all the other toxic components of railroad ties and trash. But what's funny is people think that wood is just a clean burning quote fuel, but it's not. There are so many toxic pollutants in that, VOCs, or volatile organic compounds, up and down the list. Particulate matter is the tiny stuff that gets deep into your lungs. And let's be honest about where a lot of these facilities are being sited. They're being sited in usually lower income communities, sometimes, if not always, environmental justice communities, communities of color. I'm not sure the situation in Minnesota, but in my research of this over the years, that was frequently the case. I mean, think about who's looking at a smokestack. Are those the wealthiest people in town? Come on.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're existing, again, this company, Minnesota Power's existing biomass plant, quote unquote, is in the poor side of Duluth, Minnesota. It has disproportionate impacts on low income people and people of color in the Duluth and Superior, Wisconsin area. And the facility that they want to convert, which is much larger, is in a low income community, and it's also directly adjacent to a Native American reservation.
Oh,
It's
wow.
it's right next to tribal lands. In fact, that's where the trees that they want to burn would come from. It would be the Native American resources that are being used to keep the old coal plant running.
And do you know if people in the tribal communities are resisting this, or at least some folks there?
I think to the extent that they're aware, they're not thrilled, right? So the um the directly adjacent area is the Chippewa National Forest, which is the traditional homelands of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, and it's checkerboarded federal lands, state lands, and tribal lands. So the Leech Lake have a great forestry department. They're not opposed to cutting down trees. They cut down trees all the time and get economic value from that, but they don't cut them all down all at the same time, right? They're not clear cutting the lands they manage. And so I think that they have looked askance at projects that would overexploit what they have. They're doing something much more complicated with their forestry practices, and they're not just going out there and saying, we're just going to clear this whole area and then monoculture replant it with aspen or red pine. So I don't think that they've had to take I mean, frankly, the idea of converting this plant to biomass is somewhat unknown to the general populace, but the tribe has opposed a project in the past that would have resulted in clear cutting of their forests. It was a wood siding plant specifically, and I think that they have been opposed to a new pellet industry that may have been proposed to them, but I'm not entirely sure. I certainly don't speak for them.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Well, hopefully they do speak up for what is about to happen, because even if maybe there's some short-term economic benefits, I think they would quickly realize that these facilities are monsters, right? They just keep eating and eating and eating. I always use the phrase from the old movie. What was the old movie with Kevin Costner and the baseball guy? Field of Dreams. So his saying was, if you build it, they will come. So in that case, if you build this baseball field, these ghost baseball players will come back, whatever.
Yeah,
I
right.
say it about a biomass field. If you build it, they will cut. So
Yeah.
once it has this hunger, all of a sudden people are coming up with these reasons that we have to cut in forests, which, yeah, maybe we can get into that a little bit. And then I would like to talk more about the carbon piece, because of course that's the most complicated, sort of. They make it complicated. It's not really that complicated, but the way that they've made it more complicated, we have to decomplicate it. As always, it's like a lot of our work is getting people to relearn the disinformation that they have been taught about things. But I know in Minnesota, it might be a little different in terms of cutting. I'm guessing they probably have some projects around the guise of what I call wildfire pretense logging. Out west, that's pretty much almost every logging project that I know of on public lands. They use some euphemisms around that. And what that does is, so here in Boulder County, which is supposedly one of the greenest places in America, one of the most liberal counties, they're promoting all this stuff. They're doing clear cutting on public lands. They have a small biomass facility, they want to do more with it. And they really do, the uninformed, at least, including in the government, they view this as, well, it's just this surplus stuff anyway. It doesn't we might as well make use of it. And I always try to point out, well, first of all, the cutting that you're doing is not backed in science in terms of protecting communities and reducing severity of wildfire, high severity wildfire, which is important anyway in forests. But the problem is once you have this place that needs more stuff, that they have nothing in place to prevent that. So what are the justifications? What are they doing specifically around cutting in Minnesota? Is that primarily private land? What's going on with that?
Yeah, so northern Minnesota is kind of weird. We are more like a western state than you would expect. I'm right next to the Superior National Forest, and I was looking at it today because I figured you guys talk about the Forest Service on this podcast. It's the 26th biggest national forest. So, not the biggest, but pretty good for an eastern state. And so we have the Superior National Forest and the Chippewa National Forest, which is the one that's directly adjacent to that coal plant. And then we have a lot of state public lands as well. So in this fight at the Public Utilities Commission about what should be considered carbon-free energy, there are filings where they say, like, oh no, we've had so many wildfires recently, yada, yada, yada. If we can cut it all down, then we'll never have any more fires. And that's been just so frustrating to see because it's obviously untrue. And also, it's a feedback loop, right? The reason we're having these wildfires is because climate change is decimating our forests. And interestingly, we have two different kinds of insect pests coming through and killing a bunch of trees. One of them is an invasive one, killing all the ash trees. Up where I live, further north, we have the balsam firs that get killed off on a 40-year cycle by a non-invasive insect.
Mhm.
And and the idea that you would build a giant biomass plant based on, in the case of the ash trees, a one-time occurrence, and in the case of the balsam firs, a 40-year cyclical cycle that won't continue to happen the same way, is irrational. It's just totally irrational to think that the forests will produce a glut of otherwise unusable wood on a human timeline. It's not our timeline. It's the forest's timeline to some extent. And so it's very strange because in the docket that this regulator is going to decide upon, it was even said at one point, we will have a peak in this timber availability in the year 2028.
Yeah.
And Minnesota's carbon-free law is meant to come into full effect in the year 2040. So by the time this law comes into effect, there won't be this glut of wood anymore that they're premising the entire idea on. And they literally can burn that wood until the year 2040. So they already have a policy that allows them to do exactly what they want to do. And instead, they want to make a permanent definition that permanently opens the door to developing new generation that would require more trees than we have. And that's the really concerning part. There's no concern about the long term or even medium term of what this would mean. No one's looking into the future. They're thinking about the next 3 years.
Yeah, that's really upsetting to me. I almost take it personally because I feel like in the West here, the conservation community has failed to debunk properly this whole wildfire pretense logging stuff. A lot of people are afraid to speak out against it or they make all these caveats. And so they've been so successful at choppity chopping out here that they're exporting it to the Midwest. They're exporting this to the Northeast where I used to live in the wet deciduous forest. So they got away with it here. Why wouldn't they try it there? And it's like, let's learn a little bit from our recent past. So here in Colorado, we had what they would call an epidemic, even though it's a natural cycle of beetle kill around 2013, about when I moved out here. And everyone's like, oh, all our forests are going. And they built this new massive biomass facility that I was tracking that no media would even cover the existence of. Entities like High Country News, when I was being a journalist, they wouldn't even let me write about it. So that created, and they're like, cool, we get this glut of beetle kill. They started clear cutting national forests, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the wave peaked as it always does. That's the natural cycle. And there wasn't more of this stuff. And then, of course, the biomass facility closed down. I don't know if I can directly correlate this with the running out of that free wood supply, but it tracks pretty closely. And yeah, that facility luckily closed down. I was happy to see that. But there was all of this apocalyptic uh, propaganda around this beetle kill. And here's the other thing that resulted from this amount of cutting. There was a ton of studies. So Colorado was almost ground zero for studies on beetle kill and wildfire severity. And the almost unanimous consensus. There can be some science out there for some issues where you can find a study for anything. I would say this is the closest to consensus we have on these issues. They found that not only was beetle killed forest not more likely to burn severely, it was less likely to burn severely. Something that you would not think, it was almost counterintuitive to me. So high severity wildfire is an important component of forest. But if that is your concern, severity wildfire, beetle kill, because it seems as if the lack of sap and the lack of extra vegetation on it after the first 3 years, once that's gone, it's less
Yeah.
likely to burn. So can Minnesota, what's the chance do you think that Minnesota can learn the lessons of Colorado that unfortunately even in Colorado we didn't learn?
I mean, I'm hoping we can learn the lessons of Hawaii and Michigan and Colorado. In Hawaii, the Public Utilities Commission authorized a biomass plant, and then when they were sued, and it went sent back to them, they said, "Oh, actually, this is against the law. We're not going to authorize you to buy power from a biomass plant here because it's just not carbon free. It's not consistent with our law." In Michigan, the utilities that buy power from biomass plants have been trying to shut that down because it's so expensive. So I mean, it's probably similar to what you found in Colorado. Once you get the low hanging fruit, it's just too expensive to truck all that material to the plant. And so it's just irrational to expect a large biomass plant to ever be successful anywhere, you know? I mean, again, railroad ties are sort of the exception because people will pay to get rid of them, I believe. So if you stop trying to cut down virgin trees and instead want to burn toxic waste, you can burn that and call it biomass, I suppose. But that's the dangerous thing here is that the Public Utilities Commission doesn't know the difference between wood waste, leftover wood waste from forestry practices, cabinetry and paper residuals, railroad ties. Like they're not environmental regulators. They are energy regulators, and they've never confronted the fact that there's this just random and a huge spectrum of things that could be called wood waste and in fact is not, and in fact is potentially highly toxic and not something that you actually want to set up an industry around burning. So I think it's going to be tough to get them to shut this down. Um, but I'm hopeful that they will realize at least that it's far too expensive, just shockingly expensive. And the problem is that these companies, set up an impossible situation for them where they say, well, if you don't let us use biomass, we're going to burn gas, and that's a fossil fuel. So you have to give us the biomass. And it's like, well, no, you don't have to give them anything. And yet, and yet they do feel like they get stuck in these positions where the companies are the ones dictating what the technologies will be. And the regulator is sort of like, well, we did our best, and that's all we can do. And it's like, well, no, we have outlawed this technology. The legislature literally outlawed it in a statute from 2023, and they're just counting on you to actually implement that. And that's what we have to do. We have to be clear that the law already resolved this matter, and it should not be something we should be wasting our time continuing to talk about 2 years later.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And yeah, it is one of the most expensive energy sources unless there are free government subsidies to make this crappy scheme work, which is what happened for that prior glut of biomass facilities that were built around 2010-ish or thereabouts, 29. I forget exactly when, but there were a bunch of facilities built because they had a bunch of free money to do so. And who cares if you're going to go flat in 7 years? You get the money, construction companies get the money to build it. All it's, people benefit. So are there subsidies in regards to what's going on in Minnesota?
No, there's
Okay.
not a direct subsidy at this point to develop these plants into biomass. The problem is, since this is a facility owned by an electric utility monopoly, ratepayers, the people that buy electricity, subsidize everything they do. Whenever they want to build anything, it will be paid back by the ratepayers. And then, just as a cherry on top, our utility just got purchased by BlackRock. So private equity, with its really high return on investment needs in order to remain solvent, is going to be trying to crank out as much money out of the ratepayers as possible. And to them, it might look very attractive to spend a remarkable amount of money on generating electricity because they get a guaranteed rate of return back on that sort of investment. So they're a lot more likely to embrace risk than a normal utility would. And I would argue that converting a giant coal plant to biomass is very risky and will be very costly, and and maybe exactly the sort of thing that private equity owners of a utility would want.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the good news, I guess, is that a lot of these schemes have either failed when they tried them. I recall things down in Texas, some of those facilities, a lot of facilities, frankly, failed. And then a lot were proposed and did not happen. I was a part of a lot of those fights across the US. And as much as I would love to take credit for that, and the movement would, and I think we deserve to take some credit. If you're working on a thing and it goes your way, you get to take some credit. But I think the fracking boom made it so natural gas was so cheap that compared to biomass, it was just a stupid economic choice. So I guess I don't track the prices of things, but is is natural gas as cheap as it used to be?
It's so that's a funny situation. So natural gas is still relatively cheap, but getting a new natural gas turbine is actually very difficult. There are only about two companies that make them for the United States market, and they're not increasing their production in the coming years, even though there's a massive demand for their product. So they're making pretty good money. And they have a really long backlog. So when you say that you're going to convert your coal plant to natural gas, you have to actually get someone who can sell you that technology. Um, I do think that this utility can, and they do. To be clear, the plans that we've seen so far is for a mixture of natural gas and biomass. So they wouldn't only be burning biomass. And similar to their existing plant, that plant burns coal and natural gas and woody biomass by the company's definition. So I think that gas is in the mix anyway. I think it is going to be cheaper than biomass, but if they want to make more money, they have to spend more money. And I do think that utilities have that perverse incentive that, like, whatever they spend money on in terms of updating their power plants, that gets paid back to them with a significant profit margin. Um, but I mean, to your point, solar panels couldn't be cheaper. Wind power is remarkably cheap at this point. So if they were actually looking for least cost solutions, we would be replacing this coal plant with wind power. I mean, that's just obvious. So, and I mean, even this same company has a division that installs wind turbines for other people. So that's not something I need to convince them of. They just need to make the right choice and go with truly renewable energy. And that might require transmission lines, that might require some upgrades to grid technology. But even if wind power has to travel some distance on a high powered transmission line, that is significantly less harmful to this community and to northern Minnesota as a whole and to the world than setting up a coal plant to continue operating as a biomass and gas plant.
That's helpful to understand the context. And I just want to say on my part here is just I'm not endorsing any form of burning of natural gas, coal, fossil fuels, burning anything. I also have concerns with nuclear power and really any industrial scale energy. I think community scale energy is the way to go. And I think we have to look at energy reduction. And obviously, I don't want to take the whole podcast in that direction, but I think it's ironic right now that we're massively expanding energy use. So AI, the amount of energy that stuff, you know, increases the demand. It's pretty absurd. I can't quote numbers off the top of my head, but these data centers, I was blown away. And so it's like I can understand obviously finding a less impactful energy sources. That makes perfect sense to me. But we need to couple that with reducing our energy, but right now we're actually expanding it so we can make funny memes. So anyway, that's just me adding in my little commentary on the side. But let's talk about the carbon thing and maybe this concept. I'm not sure if they still throw this dumb term around, but biogenic carbon, the idea that, oh, don't worry, any tree carbon that we burn is just part of the natural cycle, as opposed to, yes, in the forest, a tree dies,
Yeah.
even killed by wildfire. Truth of the matter is, a severe wildfire only releases about, on average, 2% of the carbon from a tree during that event. Over the decades to centuries, slowly it's releasing. It's a standing dead snag. It's a fallen log. It's providing all sorts of habitat and erosion control and cooling, blah, blah, blah. It erodes into soil, it turns into soil. A lot of that carbon stays in the roots in the soil, et cetera, et cetera. But if there is a release of carbon in that carbon cycle, by the time that that's released, yes, if we're leaving a forest to grow, it will suck that back up. That is a closed carbon cycle for the most part. We can debate whether there's an increase, et cetera, et cetera. But what is a fact is when you come in there with a feller buncher or a chainsaw, you cut that damn tree down, huge pulse of carbon, you burn it up in these facilities. I mean, come on. What are we even talking about? So do you want to talk a little bit about that? Are they using that term still, biogenic
Yeah.
carbon?
They are. They're not, they have not yet married the ideas of biogenic carbon and carbon capture and sequestration, but both of those are at play here. No, the biogenic carbon thing is deeply frustrating because there are comments in the docket that say, well, if it's carbon from burning a tree, that stuff dissipates out of the atmosphere in like 10 years, man. What's the big deal? As if the carbon from a tree is any way different from the carbon from fossil fuels. It's not magic carbon. There's no magic involved, right? It's they are conflating the ideas of um of natural forests growing somewhere else with what they're doing, but they're also conflating all sorts of things about what the counterfactual is, what would have happened. So I mean, that's where they bring in wildfire. They basically postulate that all forests will burn down 100%. And as a result, if they're going to burn anyway, it's better to burn them inside our plant than outside of our plant. And it's like, well, that doesn't make literally any sense at all. But the problem is they're making this argument to energy regulators who are not principally scientists and are not principally experts on carbon cycles or air pollution.
Right.
So it's difficult because we have to rebut just ridiculous arguments, just absurd arguments that basically burning a tree is good for the environment because maybe someone will come along and plant a baby tree. And did you know that those suck up more? Burning a 300-year-old tree is great because then you can plant a little baby tree where the 300-year-old tree is and it'll suck up carbon faster. Isn't that great? And that's the level of argument we're up against. The other very hilarious thing I saw from the timber industry was one of their comments argued that burning biomass in a coal plant is practically carbon negative because the coal plant already exists. Whereas if you build a wind turbine, it has embodied carbon in it. But because the coal plant exists, you just got yourself a free power plant with no emissions at all. And like, I mean, we can we could talk all day about whether concrete and steel are a good thing to have to use a lot more of, but the idea that a coal plant is carbon negative because it exists is just such a bizarre way of crafting a counterfactual. It's just such a weird timeline. I mean, according to this type of logic, coal is also carbon free, right? Because coal, you burn that, goes up into the atmosphere, comes back down, eventually turns back into coal. Just give it 50 million years, right? Like, I mean, what's the big deal? The carbon cycle will take care of it. So yes, we are seeing a lot of stuff about biogenic carbon being somehow different or magically different than the stuff from fossil fuels. And that just seems to be branding. There's no science in that at all.
Yeah, and I would use those exact terms in the past. Magic tree carbon, right? Somehow that kind doesn't count. Like it's separate. Like the atmosphere cares. And there have been countless studies about this. A lot of what I was doing was tracking the studies. There is still a library of studies at Energy Justice Network, probably slash biomass. And basically it finds that it would either take decades to centuries to infinity. As in, there are some studies that show there is never a return of that same carbon. That is a permanent increase. I remember specific language was a permanent increase in atmospheric carbon if you keep burning these trees. So let me ask you this, though. Do you feel like the people who are promoting that aspect of framing this, do they even believe what they're saying?
I mean, it's hard to know. I haven't spoken to them directly. Um, I think some of them believe it, but in the sense that they're in an echo chamber and like everybody is so pleased that they came up with this great solution, that's going to make everybody rich. Uh, you know, the end of all the sentences all end with, and then we all get rich. Um, I I I actually do think some of them totally believe it. They think they're saving the world. They think that if only people would just let them do the things that make the timber industry the most amount of money, then everything will work out and they will personally become wealthy. But also, in addition to that, the environment will be fine because it's always fine and not a big deal. Um, I haven't spent a lot of time speaking directly with these people, but just based on the comments that they put in the docket, it does seem like they are very unconcerned with how things are going for them and for the planet right now.
And the reason I ask that is not just because I personally have an axe to grind, which my listeners know. I'm more of a I'm more of a hothead than your typical environmental podcaster. Let's just put it that way. But in terms of what are we up against, right? So if we're dealing with people who are operating in good faith and are mistaken, there should be a way to reach them. There should be a way to provide information. They should be able to theorize, okay, if this information crossed my path, I would have to change my mind. So that would be somebody operating in good faith mistakenly, or maybe just missing some pieces. And then there are people who know damn well what they're doing, and they have just decided that everything they say has to be under this pretense of being 100% correct, right? Like they leave no margin of error for any of their stuff being wrong. And what that ends up doing is saying anyone who is a critic, whether it's a conservationist, elected official, media, is promoting disinformation, is a liar, and has to be stopped. So that's what I'm dealing with governments and even some media outlets in Colorado and across the West. So we're dealing with, and this is why I bring this up, because I do think we have to learn where they're coming from, because otherwise we're going to keep saying, well, it's just that next study and they'll understand that. But what if it isn't that? What if they know that the data is stacked against them and they're still continuing to push this? What does that change the approach, or is the approach still the same?
I think generally speaking, in Minnesota, and again, I wish I was older and I wish I'd been doing this longer. I think that the timber industry has not gotten a lot of pushback lately. In the 70s, when the environmental movement was really doing its thing, there were lawsuits trying to stop the timber industry from doing what it does. And we do have very active environmentalists in organizations like the Sierra Club and the Isaac Walton League who are still watchdogging this stuff. But I think that the timber industry in Minnesota in the last few decades anyway has gotten bipartisan political support and has not been called out on things that are factually questionable in ways that would have been good to do at the time. And so I do think that there are a lot of true believers in that side of the argument where they do believe that this is necessary to save our communities, you know, both economically and also to stop wildfires and things like that. And that's because they have experts on their side who tell them things and send them studies and show them that this is all great and it's a wonderful kind of groupthink. The actual experts in that group, I think they might be more along the lines of what you're saying, that it's a cynical ploy to try to get something going. But the people I talk to often
Mhm.
have told me, you know, like the only good balsam tree is a dead balsam tree. And I've said like, oh yeah, but balsams can be used for lumber. And a good friend of mine was like, no, they can't be used for that. They can't be used for anything. They have to be burned. And it's like, well, it's hard to have a discussion about this with you because that's not true.
Right.
And I mean that person is such a good person, and she just wants people to be safe and protected from wildfire. So it is a difficult landscape, if I can use that word, because there are very cynical people that are just trying to make money,
Mhm.
and there are very sincere people who are believing narratives that maybe are based on a cyclical die-off period of the balsam fir,
Mhm.
or maybe are just not true to begin with. And it's hard to decomplicate these things. You know, it's nothing
Mhm.
is black and white when it comes to forest management, but but especially in terms of considering biomass either 100% carbon free or not, it's entirely black and white, right? So we're fighting
Right.
against black and white
Right.
thinking, and it's hard to not fall into the same lack of nuance and just call the other side a bunch of crazy people.
Understand.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
even
I
though
think,
some of them
yeah.
are very sincere, like
Right. And I
good,
think
good people.
that's the goal, is to figure out where this is. And I don't believe in demonizing people, but I have to say, after doing this for over 20 years and information staring certain decision makers right in the face, and them just, they are either, at this point, there is only two answers for a lot of these people. And maybe people who are new to this, okay. But people who have been pushing the same, rock up the hill for decades under their guise of industry, whatever, they're either incapable of understanding basic information, in which case they're not qualified for their jobs, or they are intentionally resistant to new information. And we're dealing with that here in Boulder County in Colorado. And I'm using this just because this is a local example. This applies everywhere. And I'm not doing this to beat up on people, but I do think that I've seen a lot of people say, well, if we can just talk to their people a little more, they'll understand this. I don't think they're going to understand a thing they don't want to understand. And I think it needs to have public pressure, which you, of course, you know very well. But what I've seen in these entities, so is basically they have already decided a thing. And so any counter information, including their own studies, the County of Boulder and City of Boulder put out a study that found that wildfire fuel reduction is ineffective. That was what their own finding was. They buried that study. I've been just trying to get answers for them about why, what happened, that they ignored it, et cetera, et cetera. But I talk to them, and their staff are basically like, oh, that guy, Josh, and anyone else who's like me here, just misinformation. It's disinformation. They're distorting all of this stuff that they claim for every single point we make, to the extent where they can't see another viewpoint as anything but an obstacle, which means they end up having to demonize us, which means they are incapable of governing. I would say at this point, they're not just doing Trumpism, which is like, I don't like that. It's a lie and you're bad, right? Childish stuff. It's a version of authoritarianism, because they've set up a thing where any viewpoint other than their own is not just, well, I understand how you came to that conclusion. that study might say that, but we have our studies, and you know what? We're going to go down this path, and we'll check back in 5 years and see. Maybe they're just like, look at this lying liar, bad, get rid of them. And I have not found that going to them with more information has done a damn thing. And right now we have the county of Boulder who is trying to move forward more of this biomass stuff. I'm not pretending I'm the world's leading expert on this stuff, but I literally ran a publication called the Biomass Monitor that was a subscription-based publication subscribed to both by environmentalists and the biomass industry because I would let them do point counterpoint. So I was like, biomass people, put your best argument, and I'm going to publish that with your byline with no commentary. Then we're going to get somebody else to do a different point of view. So I believe very much in giving people the opportunity to have their perspective. But anyway, the county of Boulder just refuses to even have communications via email on this. That's authoritarianism. And at this point, I have to assume that they are operating in bad faith. I don't have the luxury of continuing to say, well, if only this one more study. So that's the reason I am putting this out there in my typical aggravated fact way, because I have not found it to work. But anyway, so what is your proposal for your area that how you're going to fight this? I would love to hear that.
Well, I mean, I to respond to what you were talking about there. So I don't I haven't experienced the county level as much, but we do in this debate about whether burning things is carbon free or not. We have a strange breakdown of, our groups, legislators, a lot of people saying, carbon free means carbon free. And then on the other side, we do have state agencies. So the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency and the Minnesota Department of Commerce, both of whom have a lot of sway in this proceeding, are making the argument that burning things should be considered carbon free based on the fact that methane might be emitted in a counterfactual situation. Now, I want to be very clear with you. The definition in the law says, and I will pedantically quote it again, carbon-free means a technology that generates electricity without emitting carbon dioxide. Doesn't say the word methane. The word methane does not appear in this law anywhere. There's nothing about a life cycle analysis in this law. There's nothing about comparing carbon to something else. There's nothing about other greenhouse gases. Maybe this law could have been written better. Maybe it could have said you also shouldn't emit methane, but it doesn't say that. It says carbon free means carbon free. So the whole fact that we are in a proceeding now where the question is, how do we offset methane using a life cycle analysis means that we are way beyond what the statute called for. And much of the reason that we're in this weird cul-de-sac of illegality is that the state agencies are pushing very hard with industry to try to get this considered to be carbon free, even though the statute does not allow for that. So we do have this difficulty. I don't know if it's quite the same as what you're describing for Boulder County. I mean, the
Right.
Pollution Control Agency is willing to meet with us. They do a lot of work on waste issues. They are misapplying both this law and their own waste hierarchy, right? So they have a waste hierarchy that says landfill is worst, burning things is second worst, and then they go up. They like say recycling is third worst, and they go all the way up to an actual zero waste future. So they're like so focused on how they think that burning is slightly better than landfilling
Yep.
that they're willing to sell out Minnesota's climate future based on just that. And that's a very bizarre application of a waste hierarchy that if you look at its totality would say, no, we shouldn't be burning or landfilling. Both of those things are bad. So saying that one is less bad than the other one, therefore we have to do the burning, is a total misapplication. So we do have this, and to what you're saying, our position is contrary to their love of their waste hierarchy and specifically their support for burning municipal waste. And then wood gets swept up in this because in urban areas, the ash trees are being killed by this once in a lifetime beetle kill. So when the trash burners run out of trash, they put ash trees in there, right? So they mix the biomass together, they mix the trash and the wood. And so as a result, to the regulator that regulates waste and like has these blinders on where burning waste is better than landfilling, they're going to let better be the enemy of perfect. They're going to let better be the whole legal standard, and that's really sad for me because it is literally the pollution control agency. It is the agency whose job it is to be the front line in stopping climate change and air pollution in our state, and they are advocating for burning more stuff. So that's very concerning. I do think that at the county level, it's even different because counties are land managers, and St. Louis County is the biggest county east of the Mississippi River. It has massive amounts of public lands. It has massive amounts of county lands. I think it is very pro timber industry, but it doesn't contain any power plants. It contains a lot of forests, and then the power plants are in adjacent counties in different places. So they may be for biomass, but they aren't quite the same as Boulder County, the way you're describing it.
Oh, sure. No, definitely differences in that regard, although we're dealing with state and feds and everyone across the board. But in terms of dealing with this in Minnesota, so is this litigation? Is this kind of
Right.
negotiating with them? What do you
So
foresee?
on January 15th, the Public Utilities Commission will make a determination of what carbon-free means and whether or not they're going to allow for a life cycle analysis that allows burning things based on some assumption. And based on how bad that goes, I expect they will be sued because they've already been sued by an organization that we are working with, and that lawsuit has been put on hold pending what happens on January 15th. So there's already a lawsuit filed against them for trying to misapply this law on this topic. Um, we shouldn't have to sue them for them to follow the law. So I'm very hopeful that on January 15th, they'll just apply the law correctly. They'll save themselves a lot of time and heartache and money. Um, but that's where we're at, unfortunately, because it has gotten pretty far down this road of how can we justify burning things when the law specifically says cannot emit carbon dioxide to generate electricity. So that'll happen in mid-January. The meeting will determine how they interpret the law, and then an official written order will come out. And then, based on that written order, there's the possibility that the lawsuit will proceed. If they do make a decision that's totally consistent with the definition of carbon free, obviously the lawsuit will probably get dismissed, and they won't have to deal with that problem.
Hmm.
Um, it's weird because January 15th is 1 month before the Minnesota legislative session sits. So in theory, the legislature could amend the law to say what they meant, but they could not be clearer, I would argue, than what they've already written. So I don't know how you amend a law to say we really don't think you should emit carbon when providing carbon-free energy. I mean, that just seems a little absurd. So I'm hoping that we don't have to hit rock bottom and have to amend the law in order to prove that carbon-free still means carbon-free. The law is very clear the way that it's already written.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So if people are listening to this, our hundreds of millions of listeners, if they wanted to engage in some way, is there a way to engage directly with that, or at least to support your organization to engage? What would you suggest?
Yeah, so we have a website called People Not Polluters, and that's I think peoplenotpolluters.org. And it has this as one of the case studies. We had 12 case studies, and we added this as the 13th case study. Oh, it's peoplenotpolluters.com. I'm sorry. And that has a petition to the state of Minnesota, specifically a petition to the legislature to try to get them to perform better oversight of these state agencies. So People Not Polluters is a great way to engage. The Minnesota chapter of the Sierra Club, the North Star chapter, does great work on this stuff. If you're in Minnesota or in the region, CURE, my organization, is going to continue working on trying to protect the carbon-free standard. And like I said, we're working in coalition with a lot of other great groups. So the Minnesota Environmental Justice Table, Health Professionals for a Healthy Climate, Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy is the group that already filed a lawsuit. Credit to them for doing all that. Um, so yeah, there's all these great organizations. Please look up Cure. Our website is curemn.org. Um, and yeah, check out the People Not Polluters website. Um, keep informed.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely encourage people to weigh in. I'm not sure if it holds as much weight if they're from out of the state, but it's still maybe worth doing.
I think attention is important. Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
people can file late filed comments in the docket at the Public Utilities Commission. It would be very late at this point, so I mean, I'm not saying that folks have to do that. But they should reach out to me if they're interested in this issue and you're from another state. I would be happy to talk to folks about that,
Mhm.
and ways to plug in. Hopefully it'll get resolved in January and we all can be very happy with ourselves.
Yeah. And we all have to be working locally, but regionally and nationally. And anything that happens anywhere is a precedent. And so if this happens in Minnesota, this can happen in Arkansas, it can happen in Oregon, whatever. So we're all really in this together, and we're trying to track everything that's going on to the best of our abilities. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about this and to engage people to take action. I'm going to, I think, do in a near future, just remind people about the importance of participatory democracy. We've been taught that it doesn't do anything, and it doesn't when people don't engage. And I think there is always a stonewalling. So I know people, right, tried to set up a meeting with their elected officials. Oh, they didn't reply. I'm like, yeah, that's part of the built-in process to weed out the weak. You have to email them 17 times. Like, that's just what it is. Now, they shouldn't be able to get away with that. But I find people just get dispirited. And I want to encourage people that with enough of us, they can ignore us. We like to think of the government as them. I mean, sure, there are bureaucrats and elected officials, but it is also kind of us. That's the beauty of public lands. People are like, oh, I don't like the government. Listen, I don't like the government for a lot of stuff either. But public lands, the government is me, it's Hudson, it's you. That is our land. We just have to reassert control and remind them that they don't get just to do whatever they want. But when people check out, oh, what are we going to do? Or even people I know who are really well meaning, well, we're already in collapse. They love people to have that philosophy because then we don't do anything. So maybe we can't save everything. I don't know. But all I know is we're just going to stand here and not give it a try. I say no to that. And I say yes to the fact that I've been doing this for 20 something years. And when I see even a small group of humans who engage and squawk about something, sometimes they're squawking about things that don't even exist and are dumb and they probably shouldn't. But that does get attention. And this is something that is backed in the science. It's backed in common sense. It's backed on the land. But what is lacking are enough concerted voices. So definitely people, anyone who thinks that we don't stand a chance, that's not true. If we have enough people, I mean, if I could just, my dream is to just raise this army of grandmothers, frankly. Just like I want like 70 and above, like out there, and they're almost unimpeachable and they have to be listened to. So that's just my little mini rant to preface a future rant that I'm going to do about participatory democracy. And this is just one specific example. We do need the lawyers as much as we like to make lawyer jokes. We need the advocates. We need everyone on board. And yeah, I'm just really glad you're on top of this and that you could come in and talk about this. So if there are any specifics about this topic, give us the last little bit and then we'll go into our last question.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything you just said about participatory democracy rings really well with us. Our Cure works on energy democracy in rural areas. And I would just to double underline what you already said, public lands issues are rural American issues. Out in rural areas, we're very low population, right? And people feel like, oh, the government's far away and no one listens to us. Well, also, because it is so low population, your voice is disproportionately strong. So you should reach out to your representatives. You should make it clear that that you are watching what they're doing and what they're not doing, and they often are very happy to hear from you. They might not always reply, but you have a voice, and as a rural American, I mean, for better or worse, you may have more political power than an urban American right now.
Great point.
So use it.
That's an excellent point for people to remember. So thank you for that. So yeah, check out the websites that'll be up in the descriptions. People can definitely go there and support the work that they're doing. And so the final question for Green Root Podcast ties into our premise, which is about the root, or more likely the roots of the ecological crisis. People call it the crises, whatever. So I'd like to ask my guests, you can pick even, what's one root of even one part of the crisis? However you want to answer that question, we'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah. Well, I'm a lawyer, and so I think about this in terms of governance. And yeah, I think it's because our country, and I mean, I guess I'm overly focused on our country, but other countries too, is built on settler colonialism. I think that's it. I think, where I live, the first wave of Europeans came and took all the timber, and then the next wave came and started doing iron mining, and then successive waves came and came and came again, and every wave ended up getting in a situation where they were trying to figure out what they could get out of the system, and it was about profit, it was about personal property, things like that. Now we have data centers, and nobody likes being colonized, right? We hate the data center guys for coming in and trying to do to us what we did to the last group of people. And and I think that a lot of Americans are not in a settler colonialist mindset, but our governance system, our way of determining who wins and loses and what voices matter, is still set in a settler colonialist system of property rights, industries, and incumbents. And the incumbents have a disproportionate ability to stop new things from happening. We still have coal plants running. That makes absolutely no sense. Solar panels are cheap, plentiful. Batteries are shockingly cheap. We really don't need to generate electricity by burning coal, and yet we have these things because of the strong tack towards incumbents, and how we have created people's needs around property rights and around, I have to make sure that me and my descendants have something, because the world won't provide for me if I don't do it myself. I think that's what's kept us on the wrong track for a long time. And I think that people understand that on some level, but it's very hard to build new institutions when we're still fighting against the ones that we have that are still set in that way of looking at things.
Cool. Well, thank you for that answer. Yeah, I think it's important for us to look at root causes. And I think a lot of us have different beads on different potential root causes. So I like to hear from people's perspective on that. And I think it can help me understand a lot of where people are coming from. And yeah, I think we have to discuss all of these pieces. So thank you for that. And thank you for everything that you're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you hearing about Minnesota. I know we're not we're not the epicenter of anyone's thinking about forest fights, but we've got a lot here, and we need to protect it.
Oh no, it's all the epicenter as far as I'm concerned. There is no place that is not important, and there's no effort on these issues that is not important as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, thank you for everything that you're doing.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.